Joining me today for the interview is Allison Dillard. Allison is a math professor at Irvine Valley College. She is the author of a number of math books, including The Love of Math Journal and Crush Hypothesis Testing. Allison is also the host of the Allison Loves Math podcast, and that is how I became familiar with Allison's work, as I am a subscriber to that podcast, and I love listening to it and learning about math, all things math with Allison. So would encourage you all to do that as well. So Allison, welcome to the Tom Schimmer podcast.
Oh, thank you, Tom. I'm so excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm happy to have you here. I feel like I maybe need to consider a name change. Maybe I should change my podcast to Tom Loves Assessment or something like that in terms of, because I like the way the name of your podcast rolls off the tongue. So, looking forward to digging in. Math is always that, it is often a polarizing topic in education, the way people respond to it, the way students respond to it, the way parents respond to it. So I want to jump right in and get started with one of the biggest ideas, of course, has been, emerging in recent years. And certainly that's the concept of, people would always refer to, oh, it's the new math versus the old math. I find the reference kind of funny in a way, because I kept thinking to myself, I don't think the math has changed. I'm pretty sure the numbers still work out the way they've always worked out. But I know what they're referring to, of course. They're referring to the different ways in which math is taught, the way math is sort of learned, the way students absorb it. So from your perspective, what are the essential elements of a modern math classroom, modern math instruction?
Oh, I think that's such a good point, because you're right. The math has not changed, right? Multiplication is still multiplication, addition is still addition, right? So
Yeah.
none of that has actually changed. But you're right. The way that we're teaching math has changed, or we're trying to improve it, right? So the old way of
Mhm.
teaching math was really simple and straightforward, right? You share a math concept in class, you do an example of it, and then you have the students practice, right? And that's a really solid way of teaching, right? And a necessary way. We need to explain things to students. We need to have them practice. So it does have some of the really important elements of teaching that are still a part of new math. But I think what we're trying to do with modern math instruction is to improve upon that, right? To say, you know what, we can do that, but there's so much more that we can do. And if we consider all of the math anxiety and the hatred of math that's out there with students and parents and even some teachers, right? We know that there were some things missing from the way that we used to teach math, right? And so some of the things, that are emphasized now are sort of that difference between conceptual and procedural understanding of
Yeah.
mathematics, right? Because before there would be a lot of just repetition and repeating the procedure, right? So the students would
Mhm.
know what to do, but not necessarily like why they were doing it, right?
Mhm.
So it's tricky, I think, sometimes to get students to understand both. But I know that's one of the things that we're emphasizing now. Another is um, another is communication,
Mhm.
right? Because if you remember, growing up learning math, I mean, at least for me, we never really practiced explaining what we were doing, and so that whole skill set of discussing mathematics was not necessarily taught. And that is something that honestly I'm seeing so much. I see it with my kids and I love it so much whenever they come home from school. And my first grader will say, like, oh, I did this, in class. And honestly, like, the next thing he always follows up with is, and do you want to know how I did it? Right. And then he shares his thought process with it. And I love so much that we're having this new generation of students who are always thinking about, well, how did I get to that answer? And that communication aspect is definitely part of modern math
Yeah.
instruction.
Yeah. Absolutely. Your first grader knows you're going to ask anyway, so probably just offers it up ahead of time. One of the ways that I've often talked about it, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that the way that I've sort of talked about modern math instruction, and I think unfortunately for parents, they talk about the new math, but I think it's the difference between learning to do the math versus learning to understand the math, like knowing the
Mhm.
math versus doing the math. Is that a fair way to kind of look at how math has evolved?
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
definitely.
Okay.
And, I teach math at the community college level, and I teach a lot of remedial math classes, so
Okay.
it's with students who didn't necessarily place into transfer level math, right? So they're the students with a lot of math anxiety, and who need a lot of refreshers on the basics. And I think, a really good example that I've come across over and over is, Mixed numbers, I think, would be one, right? When they're taught mixed numbers in elementary school, right, you're changing the whole number, you're multiplying that by the denominator, you're going to add the numerator from the fraction part of it, right? And then you put the whole thing over the denominator, right? There's just a quick little process. I'm doing a horrible job of explaining it. But it's a quick little process that's very easy to replicate. And once you practice it, 5 or 10 or 15 times, it's very easy to go through the motions of it, right?
Yeah.
And so what I'm seeing in college a lot is the students who knew the process of it, but had no idea why they were doing that process, right? The fact that we were taking that whole number and we're writing it so it has the same denominator as the other one, and why we need to have the same denominator in order to add two fractions, right? So that sort of deeper level of understanding for why you're doing the procedure is really important.
Yeah, the unfortunate part around, well, I have a rule, by the way, Allison, whenever never do math publicly. That's kind of the rule I have for my workshops or anything like that. So that's one of my rules. So don't worry about the explanation as you're going along there. But again, it's one of those things where math was so often taught about follow the procedure or the trickery, multiplying, by 9. And for example, there's that trick where, take one off the number, 9 times 6 is, you take one off, it's 5, the digits add up to 9. So therefore it has to be 54. But that's a shortcut to getting to understand. So I think that's a really important shift that we've seen. And I don't think that shift is unique to math necessarily, in that in so many subject standards are getting more sophisticated, and therefore we're expecting students to do a deeper level of thinking. One thing that I absolutely encounter a lot when I'm working with math teachers from an assessment perspective is this kind of if-then approach to the overarching mathematical practices that are often emphasized throughout the standards. Kind of leaves them stuck in a way. And here's what I mean by that. Some teachers will say to me, and this is not most or many, but some teachers will say to me, Tom, how am I supposed to get the students to the mathematical practices, things like constructing a valuable argument or critiquing the reasoning of something? How do we get to those practices when my students can't even solve basic equations, or they struggle with adding and subtracting fractions or basic skills like that? But we know, of course, you and I know, that those practices are transferable, and they actually represent a deeper level of understanding in the deeper side of mathematics. Now, obviously, and I know this question is a bit long-winded, but I want to set you up for your perspective here. So we know to think critically, you have to think about something. There has to be substance there. There has to be some competence that's necessary. But from your perspective, when you think about those mathematical practices that are longitudinal and they kind of transfer throughout the entire subject, regardless of the content, what's the best way to incorporate those practices into math instruction?
I think it's a really good question. I don't know that there's one best way, or if there is, I don't want to claim that there is, right?
Okay.
Because
Okay.
different things work for different teachers, right? And even as an individual teacher, you'll find that different things work for different classes, different groups of students, different subjects, um, and addressing the issue of foundations, right? Because I know that's
Mhm.
something that I've struggled with, that so many teachers um, struggle with, is, we get students into our math classes who don't have the foundations they need to succeed in that math class, right? They've been passed along too many years, and they're in calculus, but they don't know algebra 1 basics, right? Sort of at the
Mhm.
extreme. And so I guess, you know, a general answer to that would be, the best way to do it is to get your teachers comfortable with experimenting how to incorporate the mathematical practices, understanding that, the first thing that you try might not work, and if you try
Mhm.
lots of different things, you'll find what works for you, right? And so, I think one of the things that you mentioned was the constructing viable arguments, right? And critiquing the reasoning of others. So
Mhm.
basically, explaining what you're thinking, and learning to talk to other students about what you're thinking. And you can do that with students who are behind, who don't know their foundations. In fact, that can be really helpful. And you can start those conversations around the mistakes that they're making, right?
Mhm.
Students can learn to talk about their mistakes, right? And ask questions about them and have conversations with others about how to fix it and how to do things correctly. That's helping them immensely, right? While also helping them to learn how to communicate about math.
Mhm. You said something there about knowing foundations, and I mentioned that, having that foundational piece, and it just made me think about, how do we tell the difference? How does a math teacher, because we know mistakes are inevitable. Kids are going
Mhm.
to make errors. It's going to happen. 4 times 3 becomes 7. That happens. That doesn't necessarily mean I don't conceptually understand what I'm doing. It just means that I made a simple mistake. Is it that simple that I look for simple mistakes versus egregious misunderstandings? Or where does a teacher draw the line? Like, how would a math teacher know that despite the errors, the student still has that foundational piece versus they don't have the foundational piece? What are some of the indicators that a math teacher might look for?
Well, my background in that really comes from tutoring. I did a lot of math tutoring, starting in high school, through college, and throughout my 20s. And one of the things that I found was that my students always would come to me and say, "Well, I just make careless errors. I
Hmm.
just make careless errors, and that's the reason there's, obviously I know how to add, obviously I know how to multiply. If you're in higher levels of math, it's, obviously I know my order of operations."
Hmm.
Right? Because when they look back at it and somebody explains it to them, they say, okay, that makes sense. I can understand that. But that's a different level of understanding than knowing how to multiply or do your order of operations
Hmm.
sort of automatically and without mistakes in the context of a larger, more complicated problem. So,
Hmm.
back when I was tutoring, one of the things that I would always do with my students was I'd say, "Well, let's look at all of your work and let's go through all of your mistakes." And sure enough, there were always these repeated mistakes, right? That they would make over and over and over again. And so they would think that they say, "I'm just bad at math," or "I have math anxiety," or "I make careless errors." When really, when we could actually pinpoint, here are like the 6 things that you need to go back and
Hmm.
work on, right? Then all of a sudden, those careless errors start disappearing, right? They're able to actually focus on whatever the current material is because they're not stressing out in their mind about like, "Oh, what was 6 times 7 again?"
Yeah. Is always an interesting just idea around foundational skills, because I think in some respects we have fed this beast of perfection that you just cannot, if you make any errors. And there are times, I suppose, where in any subject, there can be a kind of arrogance about that emerges, maybe infuses into the way that it's being taught. And it kind of makes me think about the lead into the next question I want to ask you, which is, when we think about math, and I think if we're being honest, and we asked most adults which subject in school, pound for pound, caused them the most stress and anxiety, it's undoubtedly going to be math, right? So we know that math explains the world, and that's the importance of math, that math is everywhere. But we also know, and I love this expression, I can't remember where I picked this up, but I picked it up somewhere where someone said, math takes their lunch money every day in some respects, and that's the way they kind of look at math and the way adults have looked at math. So this is sort of a two-part question here, Allison. First, do you think it's the nature of the subject itself, or is it the traditional way that math had been taught before that kind of led to these emotional, kind of almost primal reactions that students and adults have about math? So that's the first part. And the second part then would be that if that's true, how do we change it so math is not wrongly seen as this academic bully?
All right. So your first question is whether or not, the math itself, right, causes math anxiety
Right.
versus how we're teaching it. That's the first
Right.
question, right? All
Right.
right.
How
So
is it how we teach it, or is it the nature of the subject itself that leads to those emotional reactions?
right. So I don't know if there's a clear-cut answer there, right? Because I think when I think about just the nature of math, I do think about public speaking for myself, right? The first
Mhm.
time I wrote a book and I realized that I was gonna have to go out and talk to people about it, it was terrifying, right? And I'd never had any sort of, education or bad educational experiences around
Mhm.
speaking. But just the idea of it terrified me.
Mhm.
And so I do think there could be an element of that with math, right? You're looking at numbers and you're looking at variables. So I think for some students, there could be just a natural reaction to that. But
Mhm.
I do think a lot of it can come from how we're teaching math and what the specific experiences are that students have had. So one of the very first interviews that I did on my podcast was with Professor Maria Ryan, who has a PhD specifically in math anxiety. And
Mm.
one of her research papers that she did was talking about the the effect of talking with students about what caused their math anxiety, like what experience caused it, and how, basically, what we ended up talking about was by pinpointing, right, what was that bad experience? And a lot of times it comes back to, like, parents saying, like, oh, they're just so bad at math, or a teacher telling a student that they're really bad at math, right? Or maybe being embarrassed. There's so many different things that could cause it, but by being able to go back and pinpoint what that one experience was that sort
Mhm.
of kickstarted the math anxiety can help students so much, because they start to realize that, it's caused by something. It's not who they are, right? And who they are can change. Their relationship to math can change, right? And so, sort of by identifying that, it can be really helpful for students.
Yeah. It's yeah, for me when I was in school, I mean, I did pretty well in math and I liked math. And as I told you prior to our interview, that I had almost thought about becoming a math teacher and had taught math for a few years in middle school math when I was an assistant principal. But it's always interesting that, the way math was taught before, that it seemed like you were, I think the part of it is the nature of you're either right or you are infinitely wrong. And that can be somewhat debilitating to people. And so I sort of feel like the way that math is being taught now, in terms of critical thinking, in terms of, explaining the math, understanding the conceptual sort of intricacies of why, a squared plus b squared equals c squared, or whatever it might be. I think that is lending itself to maybe reducing some of the stress about just simply focusing on right answers, and not understanding the depths of the procedures or the processes that you might go through. I'm wondering about now 21st century skills. We talk about, and you've mentioned a few of these, but I want to take a deeper dive into each of these as we think about some of the big sort of 21st century skills that often get talked about, the four C's, if you will. Critical thinking is obviously all over math. Everything about math can lend itself to critical thinking, and we talked a little bit about having those foundational pieces so you can think critically, because thinking critically is analyzing, it's critiquing, it's hypothesizing, it's synthesizing, it's doing all of those things that we often incorporate into math instruction. But I want to talk about each of the other big three, if you will. And so I'm going to do these one at a time, Allison. So let's talk first about collaboration. If we wanted to bring more collaboration into a math classroom, and I don't know that it's just specific to math, it's probably something you could do in any subject, but let's talk specifically about the math classroom. How do we bring, what do you see as the way that teachers can begin to infuse more collaboration into the math classroom?
Well, collaboration's working with other students, right? So I think once we
Yeah.
step away from maybe just the individual drills and worksheets, right, which are the easiest thing to do in math
Mm.
class, and step into, more sort of, um, I don't know, group projects, right? Whether it's a challenge question or just an open-ended question, perhaps math
Mhm.
relating to real life, something
Mhm.
where they can't just answer it all on their own, and it's good to have different perspectives. As you're working through solving some sort of problem, that's hugely fun and also helpful for students, right?
Mhm.
Having those collaboration type projects. Now, that being said, I will admit, from working at a community college, um, most of our resources that we have, don't really lend itself to those projects that have collaboration, right, and communication,
Right.
and all of those other things. And so
Sure.
I was thinking back to one of the ones I did in my statistics class, which was a Powerball handout, right? And it
Okay.
was, we're looking at the lottery, and basically, should you put money towards the lottery, or should you save it and invest it, right? And
Mm.
it was very open ended. And it was actually helpful that I didn't actually do the work myself. I didn't have a specific answer. So there really was no way for me to guide them through, the different steps. And it was very open-ended and helpful. And I think the challenge with doing those sorts of things in math class is that we have so many different subjects and that we need to get through in a given semester, right? That it can be
Mhm.
really hard to lose, like, a class towards something like this. But at the same time, it's really good to expose our students to these different types of projects. And
Mhm.
so, I'm trying sorry, I got off on a random
No,
tangent there.
that's okay. It's okay.
I
No,
guess
this is
my
good. This is
answer
good.
is to try it, right?
Yeah.
And not that like a Powerball handout is exactly the thing that everybody should do in statistics, but I think that sometimes, getting out of your comfort zone on the assignments, and trying
Mhm.
something new and understanding that some students might get frustrated with it. You might not introduce it the best way the first time, but just the
Mhm.
fact that you're trying something different, is helpful, for
Yeah.
both the students as well as for you.
Yeah. As you were responding there, it also made me think about the opportunity for students to simply hear from others,
Mhm.
because I think one of the things that maybe some of our students who might initially struggle with some things conceptually is they don't have access to how maybe some of our stronger performing students approach a problem. And by putting them into a collaborative team and having them do a think aloud about how to approach the problem, you may even just simply provide opportunities for students to get access to other students thinking about how they would approach a problem. And that could help them build foundation in that as well. So it may not even have to be about a project, but thinking on more of a micro level, that maybe it's just an opportunity for them to talk about their learning and talk about how they would approach the subject area or the problem or whatever the case might be. Can we talk a little bit about communication? You'd mentioned this earlier in our conversation, just about incorporating more communication, formal and informal. What would that look like in math? I mean, obviously, we know when you're answering a question, you are in some ways communicating, but we're obviously talking about some different ways of communicating in a math classroom. So, is that about the explanations, what does that look like in a math classroom?
Well, going back to that statistics example, I think there's a lot
Mm.
of different benefits, right, to learning how to communicate, regarding math. And, I like what you were saying actually about
Mm.
it enabling different students to work together, right? And I think that's actually one of the reasons why I do these group assignments, is because gosh, I always notice it's like the failing students
Mhm.
are just drawn to the other failing students, and the A students are drawn to the other A students. And it's like, well, how is the student who's not going to pass the class gonna change, right? If all they're doing is working with other students who also don't know what they're doing. And so
Right.
that is so helpful. And I think that another thing is that, we're trying to teach more about growth mindset, right? And learning from
Mhm.
mistakes in our discussions. And by having these discussions with our classmates, whether it's just about the regular homework assignments or about some different project that you put together, it's enabling students to share ideas that don't always work and learn that it's okay, right? It's okay to put
Mhm.
your idea out there and have it be wrong, because that's still going to lead to somewhere else. And so I think that helps them to see, the value in mistakes,
Mhm.
which is something that's really helpful for math, right? When students understand that, it's supposed to be hard, it's not supposed to be easy, right? And you're supposed to make mistakes, right? It's
Right.
not a bad thing when you make a mistake. It's part of the learning process. And as much as we can tell students that it's okay to make mistakes, when they're seeing that their tests are 100% about not making mistakes, there's
Right.
this a disconnect between what we're
Mhm.
telling them and what they're seeing. And those, assignments where you have conversation is just sort of a different way of teaching them that it's okay to make mistakes.
Yeah, it often gives teachers access to student thinking, right? Having them communicate
Mhm.
why they approach the problem the way they did. For me, from an assessment perspective, it's you can see the answer is incorrect, but or you can see that it's correct, but understanding why or how they approach the problem and getting access to their thinking can be very helpful for a teacher to understand what interventions come next and how they can communicate. What about creativity? We're not when we talk about creativity, of course, we're not talking about just something that's aesthetically pleasing. That's a very narrow view of critical thinking. I tend to adopt the Howard Gardner definition, which is thinking in ways outside of our habitual ways of thinking. Like, Howard Gardner is famous for saying that, to think outside the box, there has to be a box. So we have to know some things, but how do we incorporate, outside of habitual thinking into a math classroom? What are some ways that we might be able to approach creative thinking in a math classroom?
I think one of the ways is relating math to real life, um, in an authentic way, right? And a lot of times that comes back to, financial mathematics, right?
Right.
Which, when I was teaching college algebra, I felt like that was such a fun class because it related
Mhm.
so much to math in real life. And,
Mhm.
I remember I had a student who came to me after class one day and said, okay, I was going over, what we were talking about, with different equations, and I was trying to work out how long it'll take me to save up for a motorcycle. And will you
Hmm.
check my math on this? And I thought, that's a great exercise, right? Have everybody saving for something, right? Everybody has some sort of financial
Right.
goal, right? Whether it's to pay for college or pay off debt or, eventually buy a house. And so, I think the creativity can come from finding things that the students care about, right?
Hmm.
That are open-ended questions. They can go as deep into it as they want with the calculations, or they can look at it in a more general sense. But I
Yeah.
think that's where that creativity comes in, which is a very different sense of creativity than I think you'll find in other classes.
Yeah. Are there, when you think about problems where there are multiple ways to approach the problem, or that's sort of, how would you approach this problem, or trying to adapt with under certain conditions or certain circumstances? Certainly, I don't know specifically what I'm talking about because I'm not. A high school or a college level math teacher, but conceptually, I'm thinking about problems where there are multiple ways to approach the problem, or there are maybe some unorthodox ways to approach a problem. Is that something that you could see incorporating as students move into higher levels of, I mean, you could probably incorporate that into younger grade levels as well, but I'm just thinking about as math expands for students and getting into some of the into pre-calculus, calculus, et cetera. Do you see that as something that might be able to be incorporated into a classroom?
Yes, I think one of the things that I found very helpful about the lottery example,
Hmm.
was, when students presented the different things that they did, some groups, like, they dove deep into calculating the probability that they would win, right, over a certain period of time.
Right.
Others just talked at length about, all of these assumptions. What are the assumptions? It's a very vague question, right? How
Hmm.
long are we doing this? How much money are we making? What rate of return might you get? Otherwise, there were so many unknowns that they were discussing. And so,
Hmm.
the the really cool thing about that, though, was that when they shared what they had discussed, you could see that there were so many different ways, to tackle the exact same problem.
Hmm. Money and sports are a lot of ways in which are ways that we certainly can enter math. Right? There's kids say I can't do math, but they can calculate the wins above replacement for their favorite first baseman on their team, or they can calculate someone's efficiency rating in the NBA, or look at all sorts of statistics, or think about from a financial perspective. Right? Money and sports seem to be seem to be some of the entry point for students when it comes to math, for sure. Even if they say they can't do math, they typically can, and that might be the point of entry. So finding those places to bring some of that authenticity into instruction. Okay, I want to finish up here talking a little bit about we've kind of danced around. You've talked about that lottery idea, and I want to think about project-based learning or inquiry-based learning, because certainly we are seeing many teachers these days incorporating very student-driven, student-centered approaches to learning. But often, again, often, not always, but a lot of math teachers will tell me that that doesn't really apply to math, or that you can do projects in social studies and history, and you can do projects in ELA and science, but that doesn't really apply to mathematics. I don't agree with them, but that's sort of the assertion. So, what are some ways that projects or inquiry based learning approaches can be brought into the math classroom kind of seamlessly and naturally, in ways that sort of enhance the experience for students?
Right. So I think when we hear teachers say that, the projects aren't relevant to math, what they maybe don't realize, or aren't actually saying, but what they mean is that they don't know how, right? They don't know what project to do. They don't know how to integrate it into the class in a way that's useful. They're, you know, probably, thinking, gosh, if I tried to do something like that, where do I even start? Where do I learn about it? That's so much time. I don't have the time to prep something like that.
Hmm.
Um, and so I think there's a whole lot underneath that maybe they don't realize, right?
Right.
And so, I think, I did a podcast interview with a couple of math professors, from Slippery Rock University, Janet Asher and Jeffrey Messett, and they have this, statistics project that they do. And basically what they do in their math class is they use statistics like as a tool to help students become better citizens, right? So
Mm,
they, whatever their project is, it's actually a larger project with an organization in the community. And they create a math project with this organization that is something that will like benefit the community, right? We're analyzing data for an organization on something that will help them make some sort of decision. Um, and so I think it's absolutely possible to create really powerful projects and experiences for students in the math classroom. But that being said, I think that, for them to do something like that, right? To spend a lot of their time in class incorporating a project like that, there needs to be support for the teachers in order to do that, right? And so I think,
right.
at their school, they have an office, they have the support of the department, as well as just, people helping them to develop these things. And so, I think when teachers are reluctant to do that, a helpful thing to ask is, how can we make them feel safe trying something new?
Mhm.
Especially given the fact that, if we're doing a project and students aren't used to it and the teacher isn't used to presenting it, it's possible that you'll hit a train wreck of a project in there, right? And the teacher
Mhm.
needs to feel like you've got their back if it doesn't go well, right? That is
Right.
the growth mindset that we try to teach our students about math, right? You make a mistake, it's okay, you learn from it, you do it better next time. We need to make it similar for teachers, right? It's okay to try that project. If it didn't work, you learn from it and it'll go better, or you'll do a different project next time.
Yeah. Sometimes I think the word project gets in the way of some teachers understanding what we mean, because I think that the quintessential project is that we've constructed something that, we come to school Monday morning with the volcano or the castle, or we've created this tangible. And I think when we talk about a project in math, it just makes me think of a deeper dive, taking a more expansive sort of deeper dive, because you're right. You look at, whether it's in politics where we look at statewide or national polling or provincial polling or wherever we might look at, understanding what our margin of error represents. There are so many ways that you can analyze dissect data as an example, and taking a deeper dive on that is another way to incorporate projects in the classroom. So I think a lot of the key is just expanding, the understanding of what we mean when we say these things, so that math teachers have the opportunity to not have a narrow view. And I don't know that they do. I just hear these things occasionally, and I just think it's important that we try to help help them understand that it isn't just this narrow view of building a diorama in your in your math class. There's a lot more to taking a deeper dive. Okay, two questions left, Allison, as we finish up today, and I really appreciate you taking the time to be here. But these are two questions that I ask everyone I bring on the podcast in an interview. And here's the first one, and you can take this in any direction that you'd like to. But the first question is, educationally speaking, what keeps you up at night?
So, since I started writing math books, I've gotten this opportunity to meet so many other, authors and bloggers and speakers in the math arena. And I realized there are so many people working so hard, right, to improve how it is that we're teaching math. And I think you had actually talked in a recent episode, right, about the timeline for change, right? When you meet
Mhm.
with schools, early on, there's the early adopters who are really gung ho, but then there's those teachers who are more reluctant, right? And that gradually
Mhm.
changes over time.
Right.
And, I related to that a lot because I see that so much in math specifically, right? We've got the early adopters and we're so gung ho and we want to change everything, but it's all of it's those that are more reluctant, right? The late adopters, if you will,
Right.
right?
Right.
And so I think the thing that keeps me up at night is how do we make it easier for those late converters, right?
Mhm.
How do we make teaching growth mindset easier for them, right? To see the value in it, to see
Yeah.
how they can do it effectively in class. How can we bring those project-based learning experiences, right, to class? How do we help them to see the value in it and give them the confidence to try it, right? And have a growth mindset about
Mhm.
trying it in their classroom. So I think, when it comes to teaching growth mindset across a school, right, or a district, right, keeping that in mind, how can we make it easier for teachers, I think that's going to help it to catch on. So that's kind of the question
Yeah.
now that keeps me up at night.
Yeah, yeah. I think everybody who's involved in trying to initiate and sustain some kind of change in a school is always concerned about how do we make this more accessible? How do we give people opportunities to enter safely into this change process and let them get messy a little bit with the
Mhm.
change? Okay, last question, Allison. It's a question about success. It's a pretty simple question. If a random person stopped you on the street, looked you in the eye, and said, "What's your definition of success?" How would you answer them?
I think it would be, are you making the world a better place? Right. And it doesn't have to be something big, one student or one class, one department, right?
Mhm.
If you're doing work that's leaving the world a little better off, you're being successful.
Yeah, I think that's always a great goal. I think that's a great definition of success. If you're contributing and you're leaving the world a better place, I think that's a wonderful place to finish up today. Listeners, you can definitely follow, and you should follow Allison on Twitter. Her handle on Twitter is at Allison Loves Math, but loves is spelled Luvs. You're not making this easy on people, Allison. But on Instagram, it's the same handle, except loves is spelled Loves. So it's at Allison Loves Math on Instagram. Loves is spelled the proper way, I suppose. And on Twitter, it's at Allison Loves Math, Luvs. Is how we spell loves. Allison also has the Allison Loves Math Facebook page. And of course, you can subscribe to the Allison Loves Math podcast. I will have links for all of that in the show notes so you can connect with Allison that way. Allison, thanks so much for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me here, Tom. This was lots of fun, and I just want to say that I really, really enjoy your podcast. You're putting so much helpful information out there for educators, and I'm really honored to get to be a part of it.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you saying that. Thanks, Allison.